Working Cows Podcast, Episode 72.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's me, Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, brought to you by the Global Ag Network. We're going to head back into the solo episode today. I'd like to do maybe one of these a quarter or so, just to kind of talk about where my head's at and some of the things I've been thinking about. And one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot lately is the idea of free market cowpitalism. Now, I am an unapologetic fan of the free market. I actually happen to believe that the free market is capable of providing all of the organizational structure for society. Like, we wouldn't need any other organizational structure other than voluntary relationships between individuals who are making agreements and contracts, and that basically the free market could provide all of the other things that we would need. Now, some of you might ask questions like, well, what about security and infrastructure? And there have been a lot of people doing a lot more thinking about this for a lot longer than I have. And just let me ask this question real quick. And this is something I haven't heard other people do, and maybe there's a good reason they don't do it. Maybe there's a tax break that they're getting, but in the end, I think that's just because of the benefit they're providing. But who provides security and infrastructure at Disney World? Who builds the roads? Who provides the security? Who decides who comes in and who goes out? Who takes care of water, sewer, and garbage at Disney World? It's the Disney World, right? It's their benefit. It's to their benefit to have all those things taken care of and have all those things taken care of well in order to meet those needs. Now, I know you didn't come here to hear me talk about Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism or Misesian Austrian business cycle theory, but we're here to talk today about free market cowpitalism. And the way I see it is that competition enhances markets and subsidies distort markets. And so what we want to do is start to look at our cow herd as a market, start to introduce competition into the cow herd of our market. And we want to introduce competition in a lot of different ways. We want to introduce competition economically between classes of animals. We want to see which animal is bringing the most economic benefit to our ranch and which one is maybe an economic loser when we actually honestly, and we'll get to that later, honestly run the numbers and look at how they're performing. We want to introduce competition in our markets between those classes of animals. And we want to see which ones are doing better and which ones maybe are not performing as well. So there's one way we can introduce competition into our cow herds. Another way that we can introduce competition into our cow herds is we could bring in other breeds or other types of animals, other crossbreeds, and start introducing competition on a basis of fertility and seeing which ones are more fertile, which ones breed back better, which ones need less input and less, as I'm going to argue here in a minute, subsidy in order for them to perform. And so we can start to introduce competition in our marketplace. And I think which is our cow herd. And I think one of the main ways that we can introduce competition into our cow herd is by taking away the subsidy. Now, subsidies distort markets, as I said, and that is because they prop up unprofitable businesses with an influx of cash, and you don't get to see who's actually able to make it just on the merits of their business. And the same is true in our cow herds. When we subsidize our cow herds, we don't get to see which animals would actually make it on their own merits, which animals would actually survive without that subsidies. our cow herds can be subsidized the same way any other market can by, and I would say, when we are subsidizing our cow herds, it's by making feed, by making inputs and supplements available to our cow herd. We are masking the genetic deficiencies of those animals that wouldn't survive without those inputs. And we're also raising the bottom line, right? We want to cut the bottom line. We want to cut things out that are unnecessary. And so we can remove the subsidy from our cow herds, and we can take away those economic subsidies and have opportunity to see which animals would perform in our environment, which animals are adapted to our environment without subsidy, without input, without supplement, without an exorbitant amount of feed. Now, let me say a couple things here before we continue on. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have supplements around. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have inputs into your cow herd. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have feed. I'm saying that we should treat those things like an insurance policy. That if grass isn't as punchy as we need it to be, that if there's a deep snow cover, if there's a frigid spell of cold, that we should treat those as an insurance policy for those events, not as our go-to opportunity for meeting the needs of our animals. And we should have our cows working for us and finding ways for themselves to survive, and then finding those animals that are adapted to our environment, able to survive, able to get bred again without the inputs that we would like to be providing to subsidize those animals. And to go along with that, it's a process to wean our animals off of these inputs, to give them an opportunity to prove their fitness, their adaptation to our environment. This is a process. This isn't something that you should just rip the Band-Aid off, or at least I wouldn't recommend that. I've heard too many people who have gone this way say that if you do it that way, if you just rip the Band-Aid off, you will have a wreck. Well, now, we've got an episode coming up in a couple of weeks with a guy who has done it. He's done it, and he's ripped the Band-Aid off, and he hasn't had a wreck. But I'm not going to recommend that everybody go out and do that, partly because I don't want to be held responsible for somebody making that decision and the consequences that might arise from it. So we need to look at this as an opportunity to wean our animals off of those inputs. And so this is an opportunity to start to look at your animals and find those that are adapted to the environment. As I've said, maybe you're tired of hearing me say it already, but what I mean by that is that a certain percentage of those animals is going to get bred no matter what you do. A certain percentage of your herd is going to get bred no matter what you do. Now, within reason, of course. Every increase in breed up over that baseline percentage that are going to get bred, no matter what you do, is going to cost you. And every increase of the increase is going to cost you more. So from 80 to 85%, let's just use a number, 80 to 85%, that's going to cost you something. Now, to go from 85 to 90%, that's going to cost you more than it costs you to go from 80 to 85%. And then to go from 90 to 95%, that's going to cost you more than it costs you to go from 85 to 90%, and so on and so on. And theoretically, yeah, you could have 100% breed up. You'd have a small herd of really fat cows that you just supplemented the heck out of to help them get by. And so what we want to do is find those animals that are adapted to our environment that can get by without it. We want to stop subsidizing. We want to introduce free market principles into our cow herd and give them an opportunity to survive on what the land produces and on what they can get by with. So that's one kind of subsidy, the subsidy of inputs, the subsidy of actual feedstuffs and supplements and different things like that. But there's another kind of subsidy that I see present in a lot of ranches, and those are the sentimental subsidies. Those are the subsidies of, it's not a get-rich kind of deal, it's a lifestyle. And I've heard that so many times over the last few weeks that I really felt compelled to sit down and record this episode. And we need to stop using some words in the industry. Maybe industry is one of those words, but For sure, I was challenged this last weekend at the Farm Bureau Young Farmers and Ranchers Conference to stop using the word operation. Start describing it as a business. Start treating it as a business. Start thinking about it as a business. And way back on episode 2 of the Working Cows podcast, Dallas Mount said, Jolene Brown challenges families to think, are you a business first family or are you a family first family? And we had a discussion about that this weekend. Are we a business first family? Do we get the business taken care of so that we are free mentally, physically, emotionally to be present with our families, financially, so that we're free mentally, physically, emotionally, and financially to be with our families? Do we get the business taken care of so that all of that stuff is taken care of and we don't have to have a discussion about the business at our daughter's birthday party? As my wife said, she said, I'm glad that we are a business first family. It's been a paradigm change for her. She first heard that. She was like, no, we want to be a family first family. But she said, I'm glad that we're a business first family because you guys don't sit and talk about marketing strategy for the cow herd at your daughter's 6-year-old birthday party. And, that was something I wasn't aware that we weren't doing necessarily. But when I thought about it, I was like, yeah, you're right. We don't, because we've got that stuff taken care of on business time. And so it frees us up to have family time. So sentimental subsidies, though, what are some of those things? It's not a get rich kind of deal. It's a lifestyle. Or that cow raised a big calf one year, as Kit Farrow said on episode 25 of the Working Cows podcast. We want to detach ourselves sentimentally from our operation, examine it honestly as an operation, and then make decisions based on what's best for the business. Now, maybe we're going to need another third party to come in and help us make those decisions. Maybe that's the case. And if we do, then we should find that person and we should bring them in and we should have them help us analyze our business honestly and ask the right questions. So we need to get rid of the inputs, the supplements. We need to wean ourselves off of those things. We need to get rid of the sentimental subsidies. And I just want to say something real quick because I think it's important. When I'm talking about getting rid of sentimental subsidies, when I'm talking about getting rid of inputs and those things, these aren't character judgments. If ranching makes you happy and if ranching with inputs makes you happy, go for it. I'm going to admit it right here, right now, into this microphone in Belfouche, South Dakota, by myself in my office on a Saturday morning. I'm a radical and I'm a purist. There. I said it. I'm a radical and I'm a purist. I tend to think about things from a radical, purist perspective. And so when I get introduced to a new idea about ranching without inputs and about ranching for profit and about holistic management and about all these things, I tend to say, yeah, that's the right way to do it. Let's go for it. Let's make it happen. Let's apply these principles, dot all the T's, cross all the I's, right? Dot all the I's, cross all the T's. Let's use these principles, and let's not deviate from them by 1 degree at all, ever. Let's use these principles. So I'm a radical and a purist, and I admit that. And sometimes that comes across, and I want to say this up front. If ranching makes you happy and happy fat cows makes you happy, then go for it. Have happy fat cows. What I'm trying to do here on the Working Cows podcast is to present that radical, pure perspective, especially beneficial, I think, for some people who are trying to get started. Some people who are trying to eke out margin in this industry and find ways to get profitability into our ranch businesses. I think that starting out now is going to be a little bit more difficult than it has been in previous generations. I'm not saying that other generations didn't have their difficulties. I'm a child of the 80s, but starting out is difficult now because a lot of the land appreciation has already happened. I was at, as I said, the Farm Bureau Young Farmers and Ranchers Conference, and we had a young man present to us there who said that his grandpa has seen a 1,000x appreciation of the farm land asset in his lifetime. When he moved there as a young man, he purchased his land for $7 an acre. Didn't purchase the neighbor's land for 10 because that's crazy. Who would ever pay $10 an acre for land? But he purchased his land for $7 an acre. In his lifetime, He saw that same land sell for $7,000 an acre. And it wasn't being purchased to develop. It was being purchased to farm. Now, of course, there was a distortion in the market. There was a $7 bushel corn that was causing a lot of those distortions in the market. And we can get into that. And hopefully we'll have Nelson Nash on to talk about Austrian business cycle theory and about how some of those things come to be and how cheap money, incentivizes poor business decisions, malinvestments, if you will. But in any case, this gentleman saw a 1,000x appreciation of the land asset in his lifetime. His father, the young man that was speaking, his father has seen a 100x appreciation of the land asset in his lifetime. I just don't know that we're going to see that again. I don't know that we're going to see $70,000 per acre land. I don't know that we're going to see $700,000 per acre land in our lifetime. I think that there's probably going to be a correction coming. I think that there's probably going to be a correction of these assets coming. And so a lot of business decisions, a lot of the extraction-based model of ranching and farming was subsidized by massive appreciation of the land asset. And so we aren't going to have that benefit. I'm guessing we're not going to have that benefit. I'm going to go out on a limb and say we shouldn't count on having that benefit in our ranch businesses. And so we're going to have to find other ways to eke out margin. And that's why I'm presenting this radical purist perspective. And as I said, and I want to say it again, I don't want you to miss that. If it makes you happy, go for it. If you can cash flow it and make it work, go for it. Enjoy it. Love it. Do it. Enjoy the lifestyle. All of that. For those of us trying to start out, I think it's going to take a little bit more of looking at it as a business and making some cold, hard decisions on some of these things about the bottom line and figuring out ways to get it as low as possible. So we need to think of it as a business. We need to look at the return on investment. Are these inputs, is the expense of these inputs for another 5% in breed up worth it? Or should we just cut them all and figure out which animals would survive without those inputs? So how do we start looking at it as a business? Well, I'm going to steal this straight from Dave Pratt. The 3 secrets to increasing profit are to reduce overheads, to get rid of unnecessary overheads in our ranch businesses, to get rid of things that we don't need, things that are not necessary for the continuation of our ranch businesses. We need to find those things that we can live without and get rid of them. My dad was talking one time. He said that he went to a deal where Trey Patterson of the Padlock Ranch came in, and he said, we figure, and I might get these wrong, but it's close. We figure that each man and his horse trailer and his pickup should be able to serve 500 cows. I think it's 500 or 1,000. I don't remember. But think about that. The iron that we are asking those cows to carry around is 1 pickup, 1 horse trailer that they are having to service as overhead. We need to find ways to reduce overhead. We need to find ways to get by with maybe less fancy equipment. You know, I've said it a few times on the podcast. You can feed cows without a John Deere tractor. You don't have to have that fancy shiny green tractor. Another thing I'm trying to develop is a segment for the podcast about pinching pennies, about finding ways to do things cheaper. And Steve Kenyon's a great one for that. Derek Schwannebeck is the guy that I'm trying to get tapped to help me out with that. And one of the examples that he gives is that he uses a sidekick, which is like a tiny little SUV. He uses a sidekick as his side-by-side. Now, you look at a side-by-side, what are you looking? $10,000, $12,000, $15,000, $20,000 for some of the fancier ones. Derek's buying these sidekicks for $1,500, $2,000, and he had a picture of one time. He's like, yeah, that one fell off of a semi. It didn't survive that. But, we are, we get so wrapped up in having all the tools and gadgets that the neighbors have that sometimes I think we forget that for a long time and a lot of years in this industry, they got by on a lot less overheads. And maybe they were doing it a little differently than we are now, but we can start to look at some of the, do we really need that? Do we really need the 6-seat side by side with power windows and doors and a winch and da 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 da? Do we really need all of those things? Or are there some things that we could learn to do without? Are there some things that we could buy in place of those things? Are there some things that we could use that would be cheaper than what we are using? So the first thing that we can do to increase profit is to reduce overhead. The second thing that we could do to increase profit is we can increase gross margin. That means that we have the inputs and expenses, and the amount of income over those expenses is our gross margin. And we can increase that by reducing expenses. And so how do we reduce expenses? How do we reduce those variable costs? How do we reduce those things that are on a per head basis? How can we take some of those things out of our ranch? And how can we get by on less fixed costs? That's the same thing as overheads. How can we get by on those things that don't change based on the number of animals you have? Or how can we spread those out over more things? My dad said that too. He said, we noticed that when we went to this number of livestock that we were actually ranching cheaper because we were able to spread that tractor, which cost us the same no matter what, over more animals. And more animals were being used to pay for the same tractor. And so there's that kind of breaking point, the sweet spot, I would say, where you have the right number of equipment to service the right number of cows, and then you could increase a little bit more, but your labor is going to be stretched a little bit more beyond what is comfortable. And so right before you get to that place of my labor is stretched to the point of discomfort, or I need to add another person, is where that sweet spot is, right before you break over into discomfort of this is all the number of cows I could possibly take care of by myself. And I know some places that it's a herd manager and his foreman, I think, are servicing 1,000 cows. So 2 guys, per 1,000 cows, or maybe it's one herd manager per 1,000 cows. I don't remember, but it's a lot more than maybe we think it is. And if they are doing a lot of the work for us, if we're not taking feed to them, maybe there's some more margin there. So we need to reduce overheads. We need to increase gross margin. And one of the fastest ways to increase gross margin is to reduce the number of inputs that we are putting into the business. Finally, we can increase turnover, reduce overheads, increase gross margin, increase turnover. Now, increasing turnover is interesting because there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can start to graze on smaller paddocks, giving you more opportunity for rest, giving the grass more opportunity to recover, giving you more opportunity to maybe hit it a second time in the growing season, giving you more opportunity to maybe graze it as a dormant season standing forage. So there's lots of different ways that you could do it, or maybe you can graze on smaller paddocks with more animals, because a lot of people say that when you start to graze with a little bit more intensely, that you are essentially giving yourself a second ranch for free. That I've heard Joel Salatin say he buys land when he starts to introduce water systems and cross fencing. He buys land for $30 an acre. So maybe we can see that 1,000x appreciation again, but he buys land for $30 an acre. When he figures out the cost of cross fencing and water systems, he ends up buying land for $30 an acre. I've also heard other people say that second ranch didn't cost very much because I was able to double my stocking rate as I reduced the amount available to them all at one time. And another thing that does for you is it reduces the selectivity of grazing. Shout out to Johann Zietzman and his excellent texting group on WhatsApp. makes WhatsApp worth having. If you don't have WhatsApp yet, the only good reason that I know of to have WhatsApp is to be part of Johann Zietzman's texting group and to listen in on the conversations there and participate where you are able. But when we increase stock density, we reduce the selectivity of grazing. They start to graze plants that they wouldn't select for earlier. He's not the only one saying that. Gabe Brown said the same thing. I mentioned that I had heard that somebody had sprayed molasses on some Canadian thistle and the cows started to eat it. And Gabe's like, yeah, you can do that, but you don't even have to do that. If you increase stock density, you will reduce the selectivity of grazing. They will go to eat that. As Kathy Voth said, they will get that positive nutritional feedback. They will start eating it. You keep the heifers on the cows longer. They are learning from their mothers. If you're running a maternal herd, they are learning from their mothers that is a grazable plant. That is forage that feeds me, that makes me feel good, that gives me some of that undigestible protein, passes through into my intestines and feeds me the way I want to be fed. All those things. She learns from her mother, and then she starts to graze those things. And so when we increase stock density, we reduce selectivity of grazing. We increase the amount of available forage because they're grazing things they wouldn't normally graze that sometimes have more nutritional benefit than the grass that they would graze. And all of that leads to, essentially, in some cases, a second ranch on the same amount of acres for free, or for the amount of investment that it cost you to have the fence and water systems. And all of that to say that when we do that, it gives us the opportunity maybe to bring in outside cattle and be paid to graze our cows the same way we're already doing it. I'm getting excited here. Be paid to graze our cows the same way we're already doing it and get paid for it. We're not adding any more work. We're just adding some more cows to the mix, and we are getting paid for the opportunity to do it. So that's one way we can increase turnover. Another way that we can increase turnover, adding a second species to the mix is another way we can increase turnover. Sheep. Maybe we could add in a sheep enterprise. Maybe we could bring in bees. But sheep are another class of livestock that I think that is a missed opportunity on a lot of ranches for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that they eat so much differently than a cow that I've been told that this is being generous or conservative. They graze so much differently than a cow that they can go through a pasture ahead of a cow on a 1 sheep to 1 cow basis and not take anything from the cow herd. You can send them through ahead of your cow herd, 1 sheep to 1 cow, and not have anything taken from your cow herd. Don't even have to figure them into your grazing plan. I've been told the same thing about winter feeding, that you can feed the cows, not figure in any extra feed for the sheep, and the sheep will clean up what the cows don't eat, and they will get by on that. So sheep is a pretty amazing opportunity that I think maybe some people haven't considered, haven't given a lot of thought to, and maybe something that could help us to increase turnover on our ranch businesses and be one of the tools we're using to increase profits on our businesses. So these are some things to think about. These are some things that I think we can start to treat our cow herds like a business, start to treat them like a market, to introduce some competition into the market, to stop subsidizing our cow herds with sentimental subsidies of it's a lifestyle. I'm not here to get rich. Maybe we're here to free up opportunities to be generous. Maybe it's not about getting rich. Maybe it's about I have the opportunity to be generous because of my ranch business, and I am going to take that opportunity, and I'm going to be generous with what God has entrusted to me, and I am going to use it to bless others because I have been blessed to be a blessing to others. So just some different things to think about as we look at our ranches with ranch businesses. Coming up next week on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to talk about the benefits of multi-species grazing. We're going to talk with Dave Olala, who has been a guest before on the Working Cows podcast, and we're going to talk about the benefits of multi-species grazing, and we'll talk about it from a year-round perspective. And then we got a lot of other stuff coming up, really exciting stuff. Christine Sue from Pasture Mac a surprise 75th episode guest. We've got, I said that this week would be with Charlie Arnott. I'm going to bump that back till after the 75th episode. We're going to release that at 76. We've got a bunch of other great stuff, a wrap up or a review of No Till on the Plains, a bunch of good stuff coming down the pike. So don't miss an episode. Subscribe at workingcows.net/subscribe. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe on Google Podcasts. You can subscribe on Spotify. You can subscribe anywhere you would like to subscribe. And if you don't know where you'd like to subscribe, there's buttons for you to click there to subscribe on Android or subscribe on Apple Podcasts if you're an iPhone listener. So go ahead, head over to workingcows.net/subscribe. Make sure you don't miss an episode. And we'll see you next week for another episode of the Working Cows Podcast with Dave Olala on multi-species grazing.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.